Good evening, everybody. I've been told to speak into the mic. I usually rely on my naturally loud voice, but this is our first ever live streamed event. So we are streaming live on YouTube as we speak. Yeah. Welcome to St Mary's, everybody. I can see lots of familiar faces, but for anybody who doesn't know, I'm Nia McIntosh. I'm the Heritage Consultant on the National Heritage Lottery-funded project here at St Mary's. And part of our project has focused on our medieval doom painting above the chancel arch, just there. And before I go on to this evening's event, I just want to draw your attention to the fire exits, first of all. The door that's open at the back, which most of you will have come through. There's another door behind me, but on the same side. And then there's a door behind our audio-visual experts near the toilet in the corner there, just in case. But we don't have any candles this evening, so we should be fine. During the wine interval after the talk, I will be coming around with these evaluation postcards. Anybody who's been to anything before will know that I will hound everybody until they've filled one in. If you've been before, it's even better if you fill one in because it helps us to keep an eye on the changes that you're seeing. And in case I forget later, please do pick up a leaflet for Woodham Fest at the end of this evening. That's our next big event, and it's across South Woodham Ferrers and Woodham Ferrers. It's a World War I and World War II theme. We're going to have all sorts of exciting things, so please do keep in touch with that. So for this evening, as part of our suite of medieval events, we're very lucky to welcome Dr. Miriam Gill, who's sitting right behind me. But I just also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the artist for our reconstructed doom painting, Steve, can you wave to everybody, Steve, is also in the audience today. And he's kindly brought some of his hog hair and squirrel hair brushes, along with the pigments that he used to paint the reconstructed doom. So please do pop over and have a chat to him, ask him any questions alongside Miriam after the talk. We're going to begin with the talk, then we're going to have a formal question and answer session, and then after that there'll be an opportunity to grab a glass of wine and have a bit more of an informal chat with everybody, have a look at our medieval paintings in situ, and also have a look at the exhibition, which is right behind me if you haven't seen that already. So Dr. Miriam Gill, we're very delighted to have with us this evening. She's probably one of the UK's leading experts on medieval wall paintings. She did a PhD at the Courtauld Institute, working in the conservation department, although not doing conservation. She is focusing on our doom painting this evening, and we're delighted that she's helped us so much with the research for the reconstruction and for the exhibition, but really we get to properly delve into it with her this evening. She's also a lecturer in adult education for Oxford and Leicester, so she's a leader in lots of areas in her field. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Miriam Gill.
I'm just seeing if I can turn on this microphone that I've been given. Do you want to? It is a great pleasure to be here with you this evening and to speak to you about your doom painting. This has been a very exciting and unique opportunity for me as an art historian and someone who studies these paintings in, I suppose, quite an academic way. And I'm going to tell you something about that, about the discoveries, and I'm going to share with you, I think, really an overview of your painting. So I'm going to talk about how I come to be here. I'm going to talk about doom paintings in general. I'm going to tell you something that we know about the techniques through which the painting was created, how they help us to think particularly about the dating of the painting, and perhaps the sort of thing that it would have looked like, the sort of other artworks of the time it would have resembled. And then I'm going to just take you on a guided tour of the painting. I'm going to talk you through using the slides that were taken from the scaffolding in around the year 2000. So you may be familiar with these pictures, but I hope that they will give you a sense of how your painting works and what is particular about it. It's always dangerous to make a slide like this with thank yous on it, because there will be lots of people who I have missed off this, so I'm really sorry. I met a lot more of you here from the church and the hub this morning, but I wanted to thank these people who are all play their part in me being here tonight speaking to you. And these are the 3 reports which I'm drawing on. So the 3 reports around the conservation of the painting and the analysis of the samples from the painting. And this is the painting as you're familiar with it, as you can see it now in the state after its conservation. So I want to congratulate all of you here at St Mary's and in the locality for the way in which you have engaged with this painting. Around the year 2000, there was this important work studying the painting in detail and conserving the painting. And with some of these slides I'm going to show you this evening, you'll understand why, at that point in time, that was a very urgent task. The painting was not in a good state. This is a painting like most British wall paintings. It's what we would call a secco painting. So it's painted on a dry wall. Fresco, which people often speak about, that is when you paint when the plaster is fresh, when the plaster is wet. And if we were in Italy and we had a beautiful marble church and a beautiful Italian climate, a fresco painting would be quite the thing. But in this context, and nearly all of the painted churches we have from medieval Britain, they were painted secco, so they painted onto dry plaster. So we're talking about very, very thin, vulnerable layers of plaster. And everything that happens in the wall, so everything that was happening in this join between the nave and the chancel, that was happening in that wall in the 19th and early 20th century, had an impact on the painting. And so many of the layers of painting were, to use the technical term, they were delaminating. The individual layers of paint were coming away to the wall. They were no longer well adhered to the wall. And you can see here the state the picture was in. Not only dust and dirt, as you would expect on the surface of the painting, but the layers of painting becoming detached and in danger of just falling away and being lost. So the work that was done on this painting was really important. And then there's the work that happened here more recently. So this is Steve's wonderful work, which I know you've celebrated with a launch. And it was through Steve and his work that I came to know about what you were doing here. And I hope you've all been very proud of the work that's happened and the publicity. So that's a screenshot from the Daily Telegraph article about the work here, and particularly emphasising the fact that this was a recreation made with the original materials, or an approximation to the original materials. And it's wonderful that we've got those here this evening, and I'm sure you might be able to corner Steve and ask him about these materials. And that's something which makes this particular piece of work quite unique. And it enables us to really think about what we can see there above the chancel arch, because the consequence of the damage, the consequence of areas of loss, is although you have quite a lot of what I will explain to you is a really sophisticated, elegant, art historically significant painting, it's not very easy to pick out the individual details. Some of the important figures are only partially visible. Several of the important figures, for example, have their heads missing. So when you look at the painting above here, it's not so easy, but when we have the recreation, it's possible to see it in greater detail. Now, the making of the recreation is Steve's story, but when I was speaking to him before we started the talk, so this is my first chance to meet him this evening properly, I was saying that when you write as an art historian, you have the benefit of being able to be vague and speculative, and you don't necessarily need to entirely make your mind up. You can present different points of view. But when you create a work of art, when you create a visual representation, you have to decide. There's a point where you're going to show certain things in certain ways. And so talking through those decisions was very, very interesting. The particular challenge with this Doom painting, which becomes evident when we look at this conservator schematic drawing, is quite how much of the painted area has been lost. The heritage boards, which you have here, calculate perhaps 40% of the general surface area of that Doom painting no longer survives. So there are some very big, very large, significant gaps, particularly in the area above where I'm standing, so in the north side of the painting. And therefore, there was quite a lot of space to be filled. There were quite a lot of elements which were not present, but which we might imagine were present. So this was a very interesting, a challenging piece of work. It wasn't just joining up the lines and adding a hand here or a head there. There were significant areas of painting which have sadly been lost. And when we look together at the way in which these paintings were described in the late 19th, early 20th century, when maybe more of the painting was visible, you will see that those records are not very informative. They don't tell us very much detail. So there was the overall appearance, the composition, the different figures to be recreated, and then there were all sorts of details. So here, for example, I'm showing you a detail of the appearance of the foliage border, which goes along the bottom of the painting as it's now presented to us. It was really interesting for me to be working with an artist because in the 19th century, and really up to perhaps the 1950s, the 1960s, up to the emergence of really good, stable, accurate colour photography, paintings were very, very important in the recording of murals. And Ernest Tristram, who was the great expert on wall paintings in the period before the Second World War, he produced a lot of watercolours of the paintings that he conserved. So he was both working as a conservator and he was recording the paintings as an artist. He was a professor at the Slade, so he was a significant artistically gifted person. And he made all of these reconstructions and records of paintings. I'm showing you here, this is obviously on theme as a Doom painting from Stratford-upon-Avon. Like your painting, there is considerable damage caused by a later sealing to the top of this painting. So when he created this drawing, he reinstated, for example, the head of the figure of Christ, which if you go to Stratford and to the Gill Chapel, you can see this painting at least to an extent, but that is an area which is missing because the new roofline cuts Christ off, it effectively decapitates him. There are one or two things I want you to notice about this painting before I move on. The first is you can see those negative shapes in the lower half where the rood cross would have been. So the wooden image of Christ crucified on the cross. On this side, his mother, the Virgin Mary. On that side, the beloved disciple, St. John. And we'll think about how that would have been represented here at Woodham. But you can see in the case of this painting, that was on a beam that was supported on a couple of small corbels in the middle of the painting. If you look at that side of the painting, so you look at the hell side of the painting, you can see that hell is very complicated and there are many antechambers. And in this painting, you have depictions of each of the 7 deadly sins being punished in these different parts of hell. So it's very didactic. It's really telling you about the sins and how they are to be avoided. The other thing you can perhaps see is the way in which the hands of the figure of Christ are organised. It's different from what you have here. In this painting from Stratford, the people on Christ's right hand, the sheep, the blessed, he's raising his hand to them. But the people on the other side, the goats, those that are going to be banished, you can see he's pushing them away, he's sending them off, he's dismissing them. So the meaning of the painting is carried out there in the body language of the figure of Christ. In the work that I did alongside my colleagues at the Courtauld, I got particularly involved in this rather spectacular doom painting from Coventry. It's really pretty close in date to your painting. I think maybe perhaps 5 or 10 years later, but very similar in date. It's in a big town church in Coventry, and like your painting, it has a lot of beautiful detail in it, and it's quite helpful in terms of comparison. So you'll see a lot of comparisons coming out of this painting. The colour looks very different because it was a painting that was strengthened and repainted in the early 19th century. It was also covered with a bituminous coating to try to make it look old and brown, to give it that old master glow. It was a complete nightmare in terms of the conservation of the painting. This bitumen still moves about every time the sun shines through the windows of that church. It's a very unique, complicated conservation problem. Because these paintings, as I've said, are painted on secco, on dry walls, from the time they were uncovered, people's concern was to preserve them by putting coatings on them. They thought, the painting is so fragile and it will flake away, and we need to stick it back to the wall using something, very glutinous, using glue or egg, or in this case, bitumen or wax. As far as we can tell, your painting escaped anyone doing that to it. And I think, we can all be very grateful for that, because all of this very well-intentioned effort, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, has proved to be, in most cases, really heavily counterproductive. You can see here a gaggle of alewives from the Coventry painting. They are singled out for particular opprobrium in this painting, and the cheating in the selling of ale seems to have been a particular issue at that time in the city of Coventry. Contemporaneous with the painting, we have statutes from the city talking about the mismeasurements in the selling of ale. It's also possible that some of the guilds which were associated with that church were looked down on the informal role of women, alewives, in the brewing and selling of ale. So in that Coventry painting, there are lots of social types, stereotypes, we might say, stock characters, particularly these alewives who are singled out for blame. So some paintings, it's the sins. Some paintings, it's showing people of different statuses, so kings and bishops. Some paintings, it's particularly these stock characters, the fake beggar, the alewife. And in some paintings, the emphasis is much more, I think, on the moral dimension, so people's actions. I'm looking at another painting, a lost stained glass painting of the Doom from medieval Coventry. You've got a detail of it here. And that seems to be much more about the moral and the spiritual aspect than about the social behaviour of the people who are being judged. All wall paintings are effectively vertical archaeology. So any church where the plaster has survived undisturbed, you have layer upon layer going right back to the point that that part of the building was created, unless there's been some major intervention, restoration, disturbance of the wall plaster. And what happened, as you know, at the Reformation, these sorts of very figurative, very Catholic paintings with lots of saints and visible representations of God and the Virgin Mary, these were not acceptable and they were covered over. And as you can see here at Inglesham, they were usually replaced with texts in English, in the vernacular, perhaps presented in elaborate borders. I'm grateful here to all the research that's gone on through the Heritage Hub. This is the announcement, you can read this also on the boards, from the Essex Herald describing the discovery of the paintings in 1884. So this is our first glimpse into the process by which all of those layers of post-Reformation plaster, particularly it seems to be a sort of hair plaster that was put over the painting, that was taken away and the painting was revealed. And you can see what I mean here by the way in which we have relatively little detail in these descriptions. So here it just says there was a chancel arch, but this painting was too far gone for renovation. And to be honest, you're really fortunate that they didn't at that point decide to either cover over or destroy the painting, because they clearly felt that it was too damaged. The Royal Commission for Historic Monuments talks about the large Doom in black and red colour, Christ the Judge in the middle seated on a rainbow, angels on the right, souls below, hellmouth in the lower right corner, and these scrolls, and we have a transcription of what might be one of the messages of the scrolls. We also hear about the paintings which are in the body, the nave of the church. This is how the Royal Commission on Historic Monuments maps the interior and shows the different parts of the church and the date in which they were constructed. One of the ways of thinking about mural painting is that they map the sacred space of the church. They create relationships, they draw distinctions. It is not by accident that most of the Doom paintings that survive from medieval England are painted in this location. They're painted above the chancel arch, on the nave east wall, at the transition from the public area of the nave and the chancel. And you can see the scale and the drama of these paintings. They are big, imposing paintings. As you stood, you probably would have stood rather than sat, but you stood in a service here in the later Middle Ages, you would be looking east towards that altar. This would be the largest and most prominent painting. This would be impressed upon you. And medieval preachers said that this is like the experience of the Last Judgment. Christ will come out of the east and you will be gathered and you will end up either on the good side or, as we might say, on the naughty side. So this picture divides the space, nave and chancel. It also divides this building down the middle. Now you can see I was saying how the Virgin Mary would be shown by the cross on this side. There's actually an image of the Virgin Mary in your doom painting also. Probably the women in the church would sit or stand on this side, the men on that side. And so there are these divisions created by this painting. It carves up the space, it creates associations. Perhaps this was your lady chapel, perhaps some of the statues in these niches down this aisle were devotional statues of the Virgin. And of course, Steve was reminding me of this, all of the interior would be filled with colour. From the roof above all the way down the walls, you can see how these pillars, they're decorated, really, down to relatively close to the floor. You would be in a picture house. You would be surrounded by images. These paintings are the skin of the building. They're the final stage in the building programs in the building. But they're also an immersive stock of pictures. Hopeful pictures, scary pictures, exciting pictures, pictures for you to engage with. And as we can see from the doorways in the church coming out here, you would have the gallery above the rood beam. And if we think about where that big rood cross would have been, depending on the size of it, potentially the arms of the figure of Christ on the cross are going across about at the level of where the lower border of your doom painting is. So the doom painting, Christ coming out of the east at the end of time, sits behind the image of Christ on the cross. So you've got these conjunctions, these juxtapositions between these images. The figure of Christ in the centre is of a bigger scale. Then you have the flanking figures, and the scale of the figures reduces. This is that area of loss prior to the conservation. So it's hard for us to necessarily think about how this painting appeared given the level of painting that was lost. But if we look back at some of the writing about the painting in the 20th century, people such as Tristram commenting on the painting in his unpublished notes, and particularly what Tobit Curtis wrote before he did the conservation work in the 1990s. To all of these people, it was apparent that your painting is of exceptional quality. It's a very sophisticated, ambitious, artistically ambitious painting. So if we think about it has, high quality painting. This was a good artist, a skilled artist working in the most fashionable style, the international style. The picture is characterized by elegant drapery. There's a very wide range of pigments in this painting. If you think about other wall paintings you might have seen, often we describe these as having a bacon and egg palette. They're painted almost entirely in red ochre, yellow ochre, carbon black and lime white. So really cheap, basic, water-soluble pigments. And many churches you go in, it's all very Farrow and Ball. It's all brown and black and shades of those colours. Your painting is quite different. The colourway in the painting is very, it comes from the elaborate and rich mineral colours which are used in the painting. And particularly this luxurious, this opulent feeling in your painting is given by the red background behind these major figures. I think that probably the lower part of the painting is greensward, is grass, but the upper part of the painting is this brilliant red colour. In that conservation programme, some of the post-Reformation plaster that was adhering to the face of the painting, which was still intact, was removed. And so there were new details which came out around the year 2000. And you can see one here, you can see a foot. if you don't remember anything else about how to talk about medieval art history from tonight, you will delight and impress all your friends and acquaintances by the knowledge that you can always identify the apostles in medieval art because they always have bare feet. And although they are sitting down very magisterially presiding over the judgment of the nations in this picture, their feet are bare, as you can see by the little set of toes in this picture. This is a detail of the area which has been conserved and mended. So you can see the work that was done. This strong, saturated background was something that Steve and myself talked about because it is very striking and it makes the painting look quite different from a lot of the paintings from this period with which we're familiar. And I think it particularly on the reconstruction, the visual impact of this rich colour and the other elegant, rich colours against it is very, very clear. So what you see here is a mixture of red lead and vermilion, which is a pigment made of mercuric sulfide. See, famously, a lot of the materials used in these paintings are fairly toxic. But they give this very bright, saturated colour. And if we think about these Doom paintings, they use this idea of, good and bad, saved and damned. They play it out against a number of other different polarities or divisions, so most basically left and right. The Doom painting draws its basic idea from the parable of the sheep and the goats in St. Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 25, the last culminating parable that Jesus shares with his disciples. And in this parable, he talks about the shepherd dividing the sheep and the goats on the left, on the right. But what happens with this subject of the Doom is it's not just a picture of one Bible story. So a lot of pictures that you might see in churches, they represent a particular incident in the Bible, and it might be described in one or more Gospels. It might have some sort of slightly folksy or additional legendary elements added to it. But fundamentally, you can say this is this story, this is where it comes from. The painting of the Last Judgment is an amalgam. It's got a lot of different Bible sources and ideas combined together. And this is one of the reasons why all of these paintings are slightly different. Because these elements of the painting come from different places, and combining them enables you to put the emphasis here or there. It enables you to create a unique image suitable not only for your physical setting, but also suitable for the message you want to share. So the Gospels talk about the 12 disciples sitting on thrones at the end of time, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And the 12 disciples, the apostles, turn up in a lot of these paintings as effectively a heavenly jury. Sometimes that cross, the rude cross, was so big that the figure of Christ in judgment has to be shifted to one side. It's not a very comfortable image, really. This is another painting where you can see by the mouth of hell, you can see the alewife. She's being given a piggyback into hell by one of the demons. You can also see in this picture, as in your picture, a lot of elaborate banderoles, speech scrolls, with Latin inscriptions in them. This is the Doom painting on a wooden tympanum. So when Haston, rather than having the picture on the wall above the chancel arch, this area above, within the arch, is filled with this wooden tympanum. You can see, again, the place where the large rude cross was displayed. You can see how the figure of Christ has been put on one side of that, And the figures of the Virgin and St. John have been stuck together on the other side of it. You can also see here we've got an image of St. Michael weighing the souls, as well as the figures going off to heaven, going off to hell. And this painting is probably the most famous of these late medieval East End doom paintings. It's been rather heavily Victorianised, but the details in it are probably still fairly accurate. This is at St Thomas's, Salisbury. You can see here a lot of the elements that either are or were in the painting here. So you've got the central figure of Christ, you've got the throne of the rainbow, you've got that row, that heavenly jury of the apostles across the bottom of the middle of the painting. You've got these interceding figures, so the Virgin Mary on this side and John the Baptist on that side. So a different John, but the same figure of the Virgin Mary. This image of Christ flanked by the Virgin Mary and St. John comes from the art of the Christian East. It comes from an image called the dais, an icon showing Jesus flanked by the two people he was closest to in life, sort of spiritually and by blood relationship. So they become intercessor figures in this picture of the Last Judgment as the devotion to the Virgin Mary, the cult of the Virgin Mary rises from the 12th century onwards. She, in a sense, finds her way into this subject. Here you can see that heaven is at the top of the painting, so it spreads actually across both sides of the painting, and hell is down in the spandrel. It's another painting of a similar date to your picture, but when you look at this, you can see what I was saying about the paint. See how different your picture appears, the rich colours. This is just very basic, the paint here, red ochre, effectively, perhaps some carbon black, lamp black. You've got Christ on the rainbow, both hands raised, so this gesture with both hands raised is a gesture of judgment. I also want you to look particularly at these standing angels holding the instruments of the Passion. It's a very common detail in these pictures, and it represents Christ's authority to judge the world. And sometimes we only have small details. So in the reconstruction, you've got the sun and the moon, which are often found in doom paintings and found flanking the cross. And here, as you can see it at East Shefford, you have this painting where one of the few elements that's shown visually is the sun and the moon. If we think about how the painting was painted, as I say, it was painted on a dry wall. A large area of the wall was obviously covered with this rich mixture of red lead and a bit of vermilion to create this warm background. However, the whole design of the painting must have been planned already, sketched out already, because that red colour isn't found behind the large areas of figures and the large figures in the picture. And that's one of the reasons why, when you look at the painting now, you've got that concentration of colour at the top of the painting, and then you've got this paler zone in the lower area of the painting, because a lot of what we're looking at in that paler zone where the apostles are seated is basically the underdrawing. And you can see that really nicely on this detail. Can you see that sort of kind of salmony colour, the pale colour here? That's the red lead. And that was used to first draw out the outline of all of the figures, the big figures in the picture. And then you can see how darker red and black were used to show those figures much more clearly. You can see what we call pentimenti. You can see the artist changing their mind between that initial sketch where they're arranging where the figures will go, and then the later area where they're developing the shape of the drapery. And because of this, there are places where the red of the background extends under where some of the minor figures or the complex figures are painted. If you look at this figure, so this is one of the figures over there on the right-hand side of the painting, can you see how there's that reddish blush behind his nose and his face? The red background colour was put on first, and then the detail of the profile of that figure was painted on top. Because of the different types of colours and the different, for example, these different types of pigment used to create the red and the green in the picture, it was possible to create quite subtle effects. And a thing we find in your painting, I'm going to show you an example in the painting from Coventry, is two different types of red pigment being used on the wounds of Christ to show the dried blood and the fresh blood. So you can see that here on this wound on the foot. And you can also see this sort of green colour. Originally, the green colour in this painting, it's a copper resonate. It's basically a glaze colour, so a semi-transparent colour, a rich colour. We don't know what the medium in which this painting was painted was, but it would have been a proteinaceous medium, so it would have been something like glue or most probably oil. So the richness of the colours of this painting would originally have been even more enhanced. It would have looked much more like a Northern Renaissance oil painting than most wall paintings do. So this is another example. You can see here that the dried blood and then the very red blood being created by two different choices of painting. And if we think about the fashion of your painting, the elegance, the international style with its silky draperies and its softly modelled faces, and this use of this eye-popping red background, and against it the sort of toothacheingly sugary pink and green, this style comes out of Northern European reaction to the early Italian Renaissance. It's a very characteristic style found across Europe, and your painting is a really good example of it. So look at something like this. This is the sort of thing your painting would have looked like. The golden stars, the red background, and all of that silky drapery in pink and bright green and blue. The stars in your painting, we don't quite know about them. When they were analysed, the only pigment that could be identified was a little bit of carbon black, and I'll show you later what your stars look like, but they look like these stars in this picture from Coventry. And probably what we're looking at is the glue. This is mordant gilding, so you put the glue on and then you put the gold or silver leaf on top. So these probably were gold or maybe silver, maybe at Coventry there's a silver stars, but you can see it's this same eye-popping effect. And because we don't know about the medium, that's why we're assuming from the colour and the shape that this is glue, effectively, the silhouette of the glue we're looking at. This is another comparison. This is a painting now at Leeds Castle, sometime from the late 14th century onwards. Look at the colourway here. Look at this combination of the sort of pinky purpley colour and the green, which is what you have on the robes of the figure of Christ in the middle of your painting. Your painting would have had this connotation of being very opulent, lavish, elegant, fashionable. It's another very elegant painting in the Charterhouse at Coventry, again with this red background and this very complex, sort of heavy, silky, bulky drapery. You can see how it's very similar to the lower part of the figure of Christ, this pinky purple drapery. That green would originally have been really rich and resonant, and you've got that combination of the pinky purple and the green. So now I'm going to just take you on a cook's tour of the iconography of the painting. In the centre, we have this large figure of Christ. And as you can see, because of what happened subsequently to the roof, your figure of Christ has only very fragmentary upper body. We can see something of the wound, we can see something of the hands, we can't see any head or face. But if a painting such as the one at Coventry is anything to go by, the face would have been the focus of the whole composition. And it would have been shown perhaps a little exaggerated in size with this international style, large eyes, large facial features. At Coventry, we have a lot of rich use of glazes and gilding around that face. And as we've seen already, the figure of Christ is shown displaying his wounds. The wounds are bleeding afresh. His hands are raised in this gesture of judgment, so the hand wounds, the stigmata is very apparent. And the side wound, similarly apparent. That's why Christ isn't wearing anything on his upper body. He has this cloak that goes around him, envelops the lower part of his body, but his torso is open, and you see this wound in his side. So the style of this painting, it's very typical 15th century devotional art. On the one hand, it's very courtly and elegant and almost rather saccharine, rather pretty. And at the same time, it contains all of this confrontational, violent, bloodthirsty or sanguinary imagery, the imagery of Christ and his wounds. So it's very like, for example, this is the painting in the Charterhouse at Coventry, where you can see you've got this very visceral depiction of the blood coming out of the wounds. But also this slightly decorative treatment of the wounds. So this strange combination of suffering and beauty, very typical of late medieval devotional culture. We've got the Latin inscriptions, which are the messages of Christ taken from Matthew's Gospel to the sheep and to the goats. And then we have a phrase taken from the writing of Thomas Aquinas, rise up dead and come to judgment. I think it is this phrase rather than the phrase that's referenced in the earlier literature. That looks more probable to me. And it's associated with the angels blowing the last trump. So another imagery that comes out of the New Testament is found included in the Doom. So this is at Coventry. We have the angel with the trumpet and one of these inscriptions. And here it is at Woodham. And you will note, this is a period of time where many people would have been literate in English but not Latin. But we're also talking about the early 15th century. The religious use of the vernacular of English had got a lot of people into trouble. In the later 14th century, these are words from the Bible. Translating the Bible into English is not really a very good idea if you want to keep on the right side of the religious authorities by the time we get to the 1420s. So I think it's not surprising that in the context of your painting, the language used is Latin. It might also go with the high status, sort of connotations of high status, elite status around the painting. So there's part of the welcoming scroll, the scroll on this side, Venite, come. And the location of that scroll, Surgite, rise up. And that's what we see, the figures rising from their tombs. We often talk about these figures as souls. They're resurrected people. But the convention of them being souls is they do not have any visible, sexual organs. So yes, there's no point getting your binoculars out and staring at these figures because there really isn't anything to see. This is an interesting detail that the conservators found. This is sort of some of the shading. These figures are clambering out of their tombs and their coffins, and this is some of the shading within the coffin. And these two figures have been perhaps particularly a focus of attention because they're some of the very few figures in the picture where we can actually see their faces, we can see the detail of their faces. You can see this international style, slightly bulbous, large, prominent noses and lips, teardrop-shaped, round eyes. It looks as if the figure that's shown in profile may be shown with a tonsure, maybe he's a monk. The other figure has something on his head. People have thought maybe it's a cowl. I think probably it's actually his shroud. And those are those figures in context. And beyond them are probably standing angels. You've seen these angels with trumpets and angels with the instruments of the Passion in the other paintings. On this side, we have the figure of John the Baptist. This figure has not survived very well. And it would be accompanying here these souls, and beyond the souls, we would have had the representation of the mouth of hell. Following the description of the Leviathan, the mouth of hell from the time of the Anglo-Saxons was imagined in England as literally a mouth, a great head and a mouth, and hell is shown with eyes and ears and horrible teeth. So we have John the Baptist and we have the figure of the Virgin on this side. And this is an area where we have a lot of damage, but you can see when you compare this with the reconstruction how that figure would have first looked. And one of the things that became apparent, and one of the details that's in the reconstruction, is that from the way that the drapery is shown on the upper part of this figure seems to be baring her breasts. It's a common way in which in 14th and 15th century paintings the Virgin Mary is shown interceding with Christ. She basically unbuttons her top and she says, look, you know, I fed you when you were a baby and you have to listen to me and you have to give these people a break. So she is, you know, she is really pulling her weight as mother here on behalf of, you know, this is her power, her secret weapon as an intercessor. And you can see, if we put your painting alongside this painting from Coventry, you can see how that would perhaps originally have looked. You can perhaps pick out details in your painting, the golden hair of the Virgin. Her robes were painted with a mixture of white lead and indigo. Indigo is a very rare colour in the range of colours used in wall painting because it does actually fade. So that's one of the reasons that the colour, it looks sort of quite pale, perhaps quite grey, and why different people who've talked about the painting some have said these garments are blue and some of them have said that they're white, and that's because they have faded, because they're painted with indigo. But originally the appearance would have been quite, you know, beautiful, pale, light, translucent. So this is the Virgin interceding, and you can see the position in which she's shown in the Coventry painting. And on this side, we have the figure of John the Baptist. You can just about see, you know, his elbow and the garment going around his waist, the belt around his waist. And originally it would be this sort of figure, probably with him with the full camel hair and camel skin. The area below is the area where we have that heavenly jury of the 12 apostles. And in the centre, we can see at least one of the figures who's identifiable by his attribute. This is the figure of St. Paul. He's shown holding his sword, and he's shown with a long, thin face and beard. Next to him, we've got a figure with very elaborate garments. This is one of the places where you've got those top layers of paint as well as the underdrawing. And you can see there's decoration on the fabric. This is one of the things that would have made this picture look very, very lavish, very opulent. Perhaps a similar effect to this slightly earlier painting from Brisley in Norfolk. You can see there the decoration on the garments of the different saints. You can see here that the knees of the figures, it's possible to tell quite clearly that they're sitting down. And in this central group, you can see how the figures on this side were facing this way. So they're facing, all the figures face into the centre, 6 on one side, 6 on the other. So they're sort of knee to knee in the centre of the picture. There you can see the figure of Paul with his sword, and beyond him you can see, so just the next figure along, is the figure of John the Divine. So with his, beardless face and his blonde hair. At Coventry, you've got Peter and Paul in the centre, either side of the figure of Christ. So if you look at the figure here on the right-hand side, you can see that's Paul. He's got this long face and long beard. And there's the boyish figure of John with his golden hair. And that's the way he's shown in the picture at Coventry. You can always pick him out. He looks so much younger. He has this great sort of, bubbly, angelic, fair curls. And that takes us to the end of the row on that side, and you can see that little bit of green beyond. Perhaps there was quite rich grass-like area on the lower part of the picture, going all the way down to the border. And the use of the attributes to identify the apostles, and yes, they did a bit of swapperoo to get Paul in there, rather than either Judas or Matthias. We find that on a lot of rood screens and stained glass cycles where the disciples are shown identified by their attributes. You can spot here they've got those flowing robes and mantles, they've got the bare feet and the attributes. So we would look up at this picture, we would see the saintly apostles, we would see the big interceding figures of the Virgin and St. John the Baptist. We'd see the figure of Christ in the centre. We would imagine the judgment that might be delivered. The picture gives us that chance to anticipate and to think about what could happen. And that makes us think, where are we in this picture? Or we'll be among these people climbing out of the tombs, in some cases still with their shrouds wrapped up on their heads. You can see here one of those stars, those dark-coloured 6-pointed stars against the red background. Here's another one of those enshrouded figures. And one you can see slightly more clearly here from Coventry, why they end up, because the shroud is tied at both ends, so people end up with this knot of fabric on top of their heads. It may be that these monks were particularly singled out in this painting. They're not on the very encouraging side, it must be said. And at Coventry we have a monk being rather unceremoniously carried off into hell by a demon. But there are also figures that look out of the painting at us, so they engage with us. They make that human contact with us. And they make us think about how this painting is meant to impress itself on us. The painting is big and bold, emphatic, preachy, impressive, immersive, awe-inspiring. But your church is full of other bits of painting. They map out the church. They show us where people lit candles, where people prayed to statues, where people interacted with all sorts of different saints in the Middle Ages. This is Brisley, and like your church, it's got a lot of evidence on the the piers of the church of where there were images and where there were figures. The use of three-dimensional statues in parish churches really develops in the 12th and 13th century. Initially, it's really just for an image of the Virgin and an image of the patron saint. They would be up in the chancel either side of the east window. Paintings, if that was all you could afford. Statues, if you had the money. By the end of the Middle Ages, as you can see with your church, it was full of these images, full of different pictures and statues. The niches in which they stood were decorated. You've got different forms of decoration here. And you can see the scars where they were attached at the back. And finally, we've got the pictures on your round pier. Most of what I've spoken about tonight has been about the Doom painting, but I wanted just to mention these at the end because they're intriguing. I don't know really what they are. I'm going to give you a suggestion. They're very unusual in that they are large figures, 3/4 life size. They are secular figures, by which I mean they're not shown with halos, they're not saints, they're not angels, they're not priests. They're not praying or doing anything very devout. It's not quite clear what they're doing. But they're young, highly fashionable young men from the about 1320, 1330, so about 100 years earlier than your Doom. I just wonder if it's this group, if it's the 3 living and the 3 dead, the 3 men that went out hunting and met the skeletons that warned them of their mortality. This is a topic for another talk, but they are very unusual, and it would be an unusual way of depicting them. So maybe, I think this church has got a lot more secrets still to reveal. There's a lot more work that can be done on the history of the church, but I hope you've enjoyed thinking a bit about the Doom painting. Thank you. We've spent an hour together, and it's a dangerous thing to keep you from being able to walk about and talk to each other. But maybe if we had perhaps, 2 or 3 questions, if anyone's got a question that they'd like to ask in front of everybody. Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Repeat the question.
So the question is, how could I say that your painting is perhaps 10 years earlier than the painting in Coventry? Now, the first thing I need to say is we don't have specific documentation for your painting. We don't have specific documentation for the painting in Coventry. So we're reliant on stylistic dating. Painting happens after building schemes. Paintings can't be older than the walls they're painted on, though sometimes it means we have to redate when we think the wall was made. It's because of the form of international style. So your picture, you could see I was comparing it with those pictures from the 1420s. The figures are quite elongated, they're quite elegant, their features are quite delicate. If you remember the Coventry painting, it has that same silky roundedness, but the figures have got broader faces and bigger eyes and bigger noses. They've got big smooth hands like bunches of bananas. So it may be, that I'm reading too much into that. I just think your picture, the style of your picture's slightly earlier. It's got more of a feel of the, as I say, 1420s, based on the most famous painting in British art in the style that we're talking about is the Wilton diptych. So Wilton diptych is from 1395, we believe. So this is a style that emerges in England right at the end of the 14th century, and your painting is quite, as I say, quite an elegant, quite a refined example of it, before it gets too blodgy. Yeah.
Who were the people who actually painted them?
Yeah.
Were there people wandering around doing it? And can you see styles? When you look at different churches, can you see this group of people did it?
You sometimes can. Yes, you sometimes can see style, or just that they used the same cartoons, if we would say, or the same models. They painted the same subjects. So we often see this in groups. We can see this throughout the Middle Ages. There are certain groups of paintings which seem to be by artists who are repeating the same designs and who know each other. These artists, you're quite right, they were itinerant, most of them. And what you have to imagine, I think, is that you had, in some villages, you would have the person who was the painter. And he was the painter in the way that we might think about a painter and decorator. And he would paint a whole lot of things that needed to be painted. And maybe, if they needed it, they'd get him to paint the church. But if you had a bit more money, and as I say, the cost and the sophistication of the paint they used here suggests they had more money, especially if they're putting gold and silver and things on this painting. So these people, whoever commissioned this painting, had more money, and they got somebody who was, working at a higher level. So maybe they get somebody from London, maybe they get somebody from, who's associated with who's been working in a local religious house or been working in a more prestigious project. And they bring them in and they do the painting. Obviously, you have to go to the places to do the paintings. The life of nearly all of these painters is the life of someone who's itinerant. But we don't know, if this was Italy, we would, by this time, the early 15th century, we would know names, and we would have the idea of the biography of these people, and we don't here. We don't have any documentation that comes out of the artists. We have sometimes documentation for them being paid, but we don't know very much about how they organised themselves, how they carried on their craft. So one more question, or everyone keen to have a drink? Yeah, one more. Mm.
So does that mean it was a high status church in the area then? Or the benefactors and sponsors were high status as well?
It could mean those things. It certainly means that whoever paid for this picture, and there are broadly two options here. Either it's a specific commission, so somebody who's connected with the church, or somebody who leaves money to the church. The church wardens decide, with the priest, this is what they're going to do. Or it may be that it's actually the final stage of a major building scheme. But yes, it suggests that there's some money, maybe some contacts, and that there's a desire to create something that's, quite, This would have looked to people much more like a panel painting, like something quite elegant and luxurious. It would have had that mark of status about it. Oh, thank you all very much. Yes. So I don't know whether I've